I kept warning the HOA about the landslide, but to them I was just the old man with a shovel and too much free time. They called me paranoid, dramatic, even retired, with too much imagination. But I've spent 40 years reading the language of the earth, and when the ground starts whispering, I listen. The first sign was a thin crack behind my backyard, no wider than a coin, but deep enough to make my dog Ranger stop mid-step. That's when I knew the hill was shifting. I reported it. I sent photos, maps, measurements. President Kennedy Morgan thanked me for my community concern and then fined me for spreading panic. 2 days later, he was waist-deep in mud, screaming for help, while his shiny new community plaza slid downhill like melting butter. They laughed at my warnings. The hill didn't. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you love HOA drama served with a side of karma. Sycamore Ridge looks like a postcard somebody forgot to mail. 2 forested hills cradle our cul-de-sacs like bent elbows. Lawns are clipped to regulation height. Mailboxes match in tasteful battleship gray. On real estate flyers, the word nestled shows up so often you'd swear it's a brand. Buyers see mountain charm. I see a basin cut by ancient runoff clay riding shotgun with decomposed granite and a slope angle that smiles politely at gravity but never quite says no. I didn't move here to evangelize dirt. At 65, I came for quiet morning coffee on the porch, Ranger snuffling at ferns, the simple pleasure of watching fog pull itself off the pines like a curtain. But old habits don't retire. They nap with one eye open. After decades in terrain, logistics, my mind still measures in gradients and loads. It counts the seconds between a gust and a tree's response. It remembers the feel of soil under a boot, how saturated earth gives back a little too willingly, like a handshake with bad intentions. The week the weather turned, I started a logbook. Nothing fancy, date, temp, barometer, rainfall from my backyard gauge, and a column labeled notes. Day 1 pooling behind the fence after 10 minutes of steady rain. Day 2 fence post near the alder shifted half a bubble on the level. Day 3, a shallow swale near the trail held water that used to find its way out by noon. None of it screamed disaster. All of it whispered trend. Ranger knew before I did. He's a mixed shepherd with a nose like a barometer and the patience of an usher. For years he's trotted the same loop with me, paws soft on dovetail calm. Now he'd plant at the top of the slope and test the air stance stiff, like a statue deciding whether to come to life. The morning he refused the lower path entirely, I took the laser rangefinder and the inclinometer instead of the coffee mug. The grade had steepened a fraction, nothing your knees would notice, but water channels had annealed into hairline streams, cutting clean down the face, a braiding of shiny threads where there hadn't been any 2 weeks ago. I mapped them. It felt a little absurd, sketching contour lines, while the neighborhood Facebook group debated what color string lights were tasteful on porches. But absurd is another word for being early. On my laptop, I dropped the path into a simple elevation model, layered last year's rainfall against the 5-year mean, and marked a handful of spots with a red dot and a note monitor. You don't get points for being dramatic in my line of work. You get points for being precise. The HOA, meanwhile, announced a beautification initiative. The email arrived with confetti graphics and a banner, "Welcome to SYCAMORECOMMONS." It read like someone was auditioning for a brochure. Concrete event pad, decorative benches, extra parking, solar string lighting, family movie nights. And at the bottom, a map that made my stomach do that slow elevator drop. The project sat at the base of the slope exactly where my runoff tracings converged, like rivers finding an ocean. I walked down to the flagged site. Orange stakes marked an oblong rectangle in the grass. A crew from a landscaping company, Benson & Sons, the logo said, was unloading compactors like they were setting up for a picnic. No geotechnical drill, no bore logs, no signs of a soils engineer. Just 2 guys in rain jackets arguing about lunch, and a third dragging a vibrating plate compactor toward ground that squelched under his boots. "Morning," I said. "You folks have soil reports." The nearest one, a kid with a baby beard and an affable shrug, nodded at the stakes. "We got plans." "Plans aren't reports," I said. "Any test pits percolation data, moisture content checks, compaction protocol for high plasticity clay." He blinked like I'd switched languages. "We're just here to prep. HOA's got consultants." I looked at the logo on the truck again and had to smile. Consultants. I went home and wrote my first email. It was polite the way an instruction manual is polite. To board at Sycamore Ridge HOA. Subject slope instability. Request for geotech review prior to construction. Body my credentials, a summary of the site's geomorphology, recent rainfall anomalies observed, subsidence indicators, photos, coordinates, a proposed halt pending licensed geotechnical assessment. I attached a 2-page brief with timelines and recommended mitigations, drainage channels cut on contour, silt fencing, staged loading, no slab pour until a minimum 14-day dry window. I signed it, attached my number, and hit send. The auto reply arrived before Ranger finished his water bowl. "Thank you for your community spirit. Your message has been received." 2 hours later, a second email arrived, this time from the president himself. Kennedy Morgan likes bullet points and bold text. He wears that permanent realtor smile, the one that says, "I'm listening while the eyes do math." "Thank you, Mr. Ward, for your concerns. Our consultants have confirmed the site is appropriate for development. We appreciate resident engagement and ask that you trust the process. We're excited to deliver a space that brings us together." Nothing in there said bore log. Nothing said hydrology. Everything said photo op. I printed a copy of my brief and walked to the HOA office, an old model home on the east side, with the smell of perpetual air freshener and toner. Tara Morgan, Kennedy's wife and the board's unofficial image manager, sat behind the desk in a blazer that made the word community feel like a trademark. "Do you have an appointment, Mr. Ward?" "Just dropping off data," I said, setting the folder down. "Licensed soils engineer should review before you mobilize equipment. The ground's close." She smiled warmly, the way people smile when they're about to tell you no. "We're moving quickly to serve the neighborhood." "That's exactly what worries me," I said. Back home, the rain deepened. The alder I'd been watching leaned another sliver of a degree, a movement so small you could argue with it if you needed to. I took a photo from the same position as before and overlaid the two opacity at 50%. The trunk jumped. It was math enough to kill denial. On day 5 of the storm, I met Eileen Parker at the mailbox bank. Eileen is the kind of neighbor every street deserves. Quiet competence in a sun hat, the practical kindness of a retired nurse who still counts pills in her head. "Aaron," she said, voice low, "I've got hairline cracks in my basement I've never seen before." "Where?" I asked. "North wall by the sump. And the back patio's dropped a 1/4 inch. I measured. Twice." She was watching the hill when she said it, not me. I liked her more for that. I told her what I'd been tracking, the water channels, the grade, the alder, the compaction issues, the slab plan. I didn't dramatize a thing. I just laid the pieces on the table and let the picture draw itself. "My nephew runs a local news blog," she said finally. Quiet, but read by all the contractors. "He could shine a little light. Light helps," I said. "But the ground is going to do the talking." That night, Sycamore Ridge HOA ignores landslide warnings. Pushes ahead with Plaza went up on a site I'd never heard of. It wasn't inflammatory. It just quoted my email, which meant someone forwarded it, showed a photo of the flagged pad sitting in a puddle, and printed a few lines from the HOA's newsletter about progress. The comments were a split screen, half neighbors worried, the other half moaning about people who hate change. The board responded the next morning with a mass email titled "Clarity and Unity." It thanked residents for their passion, lamented unverified alarmism, and reminded everyone that our community thrives on trust. At the end, a paragraph in italics: "Please refrain from approaching contracted workers on site. Questions should be directed to the board." Translation: stop talking to the guys with the compactors. I sent a second email, shorter, sharper, attaching new photos, and a rainfall chart, adding a line in bold: "Recommend immediate halt, pending third-party geotechnical review." Then I called an old colleague. "Sarah Miller and I have sweated through hurricane tents and slept on gym floors, while the world reset itself on the other side of cinder block walls." She runs planning for the county's emergency office, now the kind of person who can look at a map and see tomorrow's problem waving. "Ward," she said, when she picked up voice, equal parts tired and amused, "tell me you're finally taking up fishing." "Wish I were," I said. "Send me a licensed geotech if you've got one not already underwater." I sent her the package. She texted back 2 hours later. "Got movement indicators. Pushing for eyes on. No promises, red tape rain everywhere. Bureaucracy is a tide you learn to read. You don't fight it. You time your breath." By late afternoon, the site sprouted a fresh set of stakes and a glossy sign mounted on 2x4s, "Combing soon, Sycamore Commons." Underneath a rendering so sentimental it could have been a greeting card, families on benches, string lights, a movie screen under a starry sky. There was no rain in the picture, no mud, just pretty people and a slab that believed in itself. Ranger and I stood at the edge of the tape and listened to the ground. You can't hear a hillside move unless you learn what silence sounds like just before it stops being silence. It's air tightening in the throat of a valley. It's a certain way water hisses when it courses under the skin of the earth instead of over it. It's the absence of birds at hours when birds ought to be there. I sent one more note to the board flagged urgent and copied the city engineering inbox for good measure. For the first time, I added a sentence I don't use lightly: lives could be at risk if loading continues under current saturation. Then I closed the laptop, set the kettle, and leaned at the window with Ranger settling against my boots. The rain drummed, the alder leaned. Somewhere in the distance, a compactor hummed like a stubborn idea. At dawn the next day, flatbeds rolled in at 7:12 a.m., punctual as guilt. A man with a clipboard and an HOA windbreaker, Cole Benson, vice president and owner of the landscaping logo, paced the perimeter while the crew unrolled vapor barrier on ground that would have slurped up a man if he stood still long enough. He saw me over the fence and gave me the kind of smile you save for speed bumps. I took a final set of measurements and printed hard copies of everything: photos, angles, rainfall channels, predictions. Paper still has a weight that email doesn't. I slipped the folder into a plastic sleeve, put on my old field shirt, not a costume, just a tool, and walked back to the office. Mr. Ward Terra said, smile already deployed. Back again, same reason, I said, setting the folder down. This is the third time I've submitted. The site needs a licensed assessment. Pause test, then pour. She held the smile the way a person holds a plank. We're committed to progress. So is gravity, I said. Outside, the rain didn't let up. Neither did I. The ground was keeping receipts, and I planned to keep mine too. The only difference was, mine had dates, coordinates, and a signature. The hills had consequences. By the time the HOA sent out its next newsletter, I already knew how the month would end, with the same pattern that kills every good neighborhood: smiles in public denial and print and silence when the ground finally answers. The newsletter headline read, Community Growth Through Collaboration. It talked about unity, about neighbors building something beautiful together. No mention of slope angles, no mention of risk. I wasn't surprised. HOA boards don't do geology, they do optics. Still, I showed up at the next meeting. The clubhouse was really a rebranded garage attached to an old model home, but they liked to call it the Sycamore Ridge Civic Center. Rows of folding chairs faced a banner that read, Progress is our tradition. On the front wall hung a framed aerial photo of the neighborhood, bright, peaceful, full of lies. I sat in the back, muddy boots, rain jacket, clipboard under one arm. Ranger waited outside, watching through the glass door like my furry security detail. President Kennedy Morgan started the meeting with that realtor grin of his all-white teeth and zero listening capacity. His wife Tara, sitting beside him, nodded dutifully while scribbling notes that nobody would ever read. Next to her, Cole Benson, the vice president, scrolled on his phone like a teenager trapped in Sunday school. Before we get to the budget and landscaping updates, Kennedy said we'd like to open the floor to community feedback. We'll keep comments to 2 minutes per person. 2 minutes. That's what a lifetime of experience was worth to them. I stood up slow but steady and walked to the front. A few neighbors nodded politely. Others pretended to check their watches. I placed my notes on the podium and spoke in the calm, clipped tone that 20 years of military briefings had burned into me. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. I've been monitoring the slope behind lots 35 through 42. The rainfall saturation over the past 2 months has pushed us past the critical threshold for shear failure. I've measured surface movement of nearly 2 inches in the last 10 days. That hill is active. If you continue loading it with construction equipment, it will collapse. The room went still. You could hear the HVAC clicking in the background. Kennedy gave a slow, patient smile, the kind of smile reserved for children and fools. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Ward. Our consultants have reviewed the area and found no imminent danger. I looked directly at him. What consultants? A landscaping and grading firm out of Tacoma. Experienced folks. I let out a dry laugh. Landscaping isn't geology, Mr. Morgan. That's like hiring a florist to run a pharmacy. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd, the kind that says someone just said what we were thinking but were too polite to clap. Kennedy's eyes narrowed. Mr. Ward, this meeting is for community updates, not fear-mongering. We all want Sycamore Ridge to thrive. Let's not let alarmism distract from progress. Progress, I said. You're building a concrete plaza on liquefying clay. That's not progress. That's hubris with a brochure. Tara whispered something to him, and he forced another smile. Thank you, Mr. Ward. Your time is up. The polite applause that followed sounded like nails on metal. I sat back down, jaw tight, and watched them move on to patio paint color guidelines. Because obviously the shade of beige mattered more than the integrity of the hill we all lived on. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors approached me quietly, the ones who'd actually noticed their fences leaning or their basement doors sticking. "Do you really think it's that bad?" one asked. "It's worse," I said simply. That night, I sent another package to the city engineering department, this time marked Urgent Hazard Review Request. I attached every dataset slope, photo, and rain accumulation chart I had. Bureaucracy moves slower than erosion, but at least paper trails leave scars. 2 days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox with the HOA logo on top. Subject violation notice. Misinformation and interference. Dear Mr. Ward. This letter serves as a formal reminder that spreading unverified geological claims and approaching contractors during active work hours constitutes interference with an approved HOA project. Please cease these actions immediately to avoid fines or disciplinary measures. Respectfully, the Sycamore Ridge HOA Board. They fined me for caring. I taped the letter to my refrigerator as a reminder of what arrogance looks like in writing. That evening, I walked Ranger down the trail. The rain had softened the air, and fog hung over the slope like a ghost, unsure whether to stay or leave. The alder I'd been tracking was now leaning a full 3 degrees. The base of the tree bulged where the soil was beginning to heave. Ranger sniffed the ground, whined, and backed away. "Yeah," I muttered. "I feel it too." Back home, I opened my old field toolkit, the one that still smelled faintly of diesel and jungle mud from Peru. I set up a makeshift monitoring line with stakes and fluorescent cord measuring every quarter-meter of movement. Then I mounted a GoPro on the railing, angled it toward the hill, and programmed it to take time-lapse photos every 10 minutes. If the city ignored me too, I'd have footage that couldn't be dismissed. 3 nights later, Eileen Parker knocked on my door holding a mug of coffee and a face that said she'd seen enough. "Aaron, my basement's cracking. The north wall. I can fit a nickel in it." "Then it's already begun," I said. She looked at me the way people look at the sky when thunder's coming. "What can we do?" "Document everything. Take photos, timestamps, measurements, and if you see water pooling behind your house, call me immediately." She nodded, brave but shaken. Before leaving, she asked quietly, "Do you think they'll listen now?" I smiled without humor. "They'll listen when the hill does the talking." The following morning, the HOA sent another cheerful email blast. "Community celebration this Saturday. Coffee and donuts on the new concrete pad. A ribbon-cutting ceremony. Speeches about progress." I almost laughed myself off the porch. That same day, my phone buzzed with a call from Sarah Miller at the county emergency office. "I pushed your data through unofficially," she said. "Had one of our geotech guys look at it." His words, not mine. "Significant subsurface saturation slope nearing critical failure threshold." "You were right. Can you issue a stop order?" I asked. "I'm trying. It's a county-city overlap, so it'll take signatures." "But Aaron, you need to be careful. If that hill goes, it'll go fast." I thanked her and sent one last email to Kennedy, attaching Sarah's message and underlining the key phrase, "Recommend immediate halt of all site operations." No reply. Instead, the next morning, 3 flatbed trucks rolled in again. I watched from my fence line as Cole Benson directed the unloading clipboard and hand grinned smug enough to shine through the drizzle. One of the workers noticed me photographing and muttered something to him. Cole looked up, smirked, and gave me a slow, sarcastic salute. "Ranger," I said quietly, "remember that face." That night, I wrote a note by hand, big letters, black ink, "Notice of geological hazard, imminent risk. Continued construction may result in structural collapse and injury. AARON Ward. Ret Military Engineering Corps. At 11:00 p.m. Under steady rain, I walked down and taped it to the half-finished construction sign. The pad gleamed wet and pale under the floodlights. Behind it, the hill looked swollen, heavy, waiting. The next morning, my notice was gone. In its place, the HOA had posted a laminated sign, "Authorized construction site. Trespassers will be reported." I didn't get angry. Not anymore. Anger takes energy, and I was saving mine for what came next. That afternoon, I stood on my porch with binoculars and watched the rain carve new paths through the slope. Little rivulets joining, merging, etching deeper into the earth. I marked every one on my map. By sunset, the first crack had appeared along the upper edge, not on my side, but just above the new concrete pad. It ran jagged like a lightning bolt across the wet clay. Ranger barked once. I looked at the sky, dark and swollen with another incoming storm. "Not yet," I whispered, "but soon." Inside, I checked my GoPro footage. The last few frames showed the alder shifting again, the fence line, dipping by nearly half an inch. It was undeniable now. I compiled everything: photos, charts, timestamps, weather data, into a single PDF titled Sycamore Ridge Slope Movement 48-Hour Summary. Then I attached it to an email with the subject line, Final Warning Active, Landslide Conditions. Recipients HOA Board, City Engineering County Emergency Office, Local News Desk. The message was short. This is not speculation. This is physics. You are endangering lives. I hit send. Then I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and listened to the soft rumble beneath the rain, the heartbeat of a hill waiting to wake up. Somewhere out there, the ground was preparing its verdict, and I knew with a kind of grim certainty that when it finally spoke, it wouldn't be gentle. The rain didn't pound so much as persistent argument the sky refused to lose. By the third straight day of saturation, the neighborhood smelled like wet bark and driveway sealer, a mix that always means someone is pretending control is possible. Ranger and I made our morning loop along the upper path. He paused where the trail overlooks the planned plaza ears, pricked nose, working the breeze like a tuner searching for the right station. I felt it too, a tightness in the air as if the whole hillside had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. I took fresh angles with the inclinometer and logged them, plus 0.3 degrees since yesterday near the alder, plus 0.5 on the mid-slope swale. 2 new micro-rivulets had cut themselves into quicksilver threads, feeding a broader, muddier vein that ran straight toward the rectangle of newly poured concrete. The pad had a sheen in the breathless morning blades of grass pressed flat around it like a cowlick. On the far side, orange stakes bent a little toward the creek, as if persuaded by something you couldn't see. Back at the house, I synced the time-lapse. In 30 seconds, 5 hours of nothing became a conversation tree, crowns nodding too long after gusts, the fence lines settling like acai puddles bulging at their edges before collapsing into channels. The alder's lean ticked another fraction. Little movements, but a pattern of inevitability. When you read terrain, you don't look for drama, you look for agreement among small truths. Eileen Parker called at 9. "Aaron," she said, voice clipped, "I've got fresh seepage along the basement slab. Smells like the garden. Can water smell like a garden? Wet soil does," I said. "It's the hillside breathing through the cracks. Send me photos and lay a straight edge across that slab. If you've got differential lift, I want it time-stamped." She was back on the line 10 minutes later. "It's high by 3/16 along the north edge." "Log it," I said. "And Eileen, move anything valuable off that wall." She didn't ask if it would be all right. She already knew. That's who she is, the neighbor who listens the first time. By mid-morning, Jake Parker had a new post up on his hyperlocal site, Slope Watch Residents Report Basement Cracks, and Seepage as HOA moves forward with Plaza. It wasn't sensational, but it placed a photograph of yesterday's hairline split on the upper slope alongside a quote from the HOA newsletter. "We're thrilled to deliver a safe, beautiful space that brings us together." The comment section lit like a storm front. Half the neighborhood formed a Greek chorus of common sense. The other half insisted I was the reason their property values felt nervous. At 1117, the HOA emailed a reply under the banner, "Clarification and Community Pride." I read it out loud to Ranger because talking to a dog is better than yelling at a screen. "We have consulted experienced contractors. We will not be derailed by fear. We invite all neighbors to celebrate progress this Saturday at 10 a.m. with coffee donuts and a ribbon cutting at Sycamore Commons." Donuts, I said. The universal antidote to physics. Ranger thumped his tail exactly once. He is a supportive audience. I called Sarah Miller at lunch. She answered with a sigh shaped like a triage chart. "We've got 3 washed-out county roads and a creek that thinks it's a river," she said. "But I shoved your packet in front of a geotech who owes me favors. He's flagged your slope as a hot spot, significant shear risk if loading continues." "Can he put that in writing?" I asked. "In an email, yes. In an official notice, not yet. We need field verification for that, and the field is drowning." "Email is fine," I said. "Paper first, signatures later. That's the order of survival." While I waited, I put on the field shirt again, not for theater, for pockets. I walked the property line with flagging tape and dropped 3 more stakes into the soft ground, marking the telltale little hollows forming along the slope spoon-shaped sags that only exist when the subsurface picks a direction, commits to it. I snapped photos from the same spots as before, matching the framing, so anyone could lay one over another and see the land shifting like a slow bruise. The email from the county geotech arrived at 2:43 p.m. Preliminary observation desk review. Subsurface saturation, likely given rainfall totals versus 5-year mean. Observed indicators of shallow translational failure, surface cracking, leaning vegetation pooling. Recommendation: halt surface loading and slab work pending site inspection. risk escalating under current precipitation. I forwarded it to the HOA, the city engineering inbox, and because some truths should be public, the neighborhood list. I didn't add commentary. I didn't have to. The subject line said everything County Geotech Halt recommended at 3:12 p.m. The HOA replied with something that looked like it had been drafted by an attorney who bills in 6-minute increments. While we respect the county's diligence, the recommendation reflects a desk review, not an on-site assessment. Our project remains compliant. Then they doubled down on Saturday's celebration, bolding the word together twice for luck. I spent the late afternoon outside in the rain, doing the unglamorous work of a man who knows what's coming and refuses to be surprised by it. I set a datum stake at the fence corner and ran a taut nylon line to a second stake upslope, marking both with paint so I could see if the distance changed by even a hair. I jammed 2 cheap crack gauges into gaps along the upper seam where the clay slab had started to split. I made a list on a yellow pad: flashlights, batteries, whistle, med kit, rope. Then I set the list on the foyer table beside my keys and a pair of work gloves worn smooth by lives. I don't talk about much. A wind gust shook the firs and made the phone lines sing. The sky went a color I don't trust, too bright, too flat. Ranger stood at the slider and stared quiet as a thought you can't pin down. I opened the door and let the wet air in. It smelled like moss and metal. At dusk, Eileen texted a photo of her patio with a tape measure spanning a new drop. 1/4-inch south edge. The sump's running constantly. Leave it, I wrote back. Don't fight the water, it's telling us the map. At 9, someone banged on my door like the end of a movie. It was Cole Benson. Rain slicked off his HOA windbreaker in glossy sheets. He didn't bother to step back from the threshold. You keep scaring people, he said, voice low. Posting your little emails. You want to tank values. Because that's how you tank values. Values survive reality checks, I said. They don't survive lawsuits and body bags. He puffed up like a man who likes his reflection. We've got this under control. Show me the bore logs, Cole. He blinked. The what exactly, I said, and closed the door. I made coffee because ritual is ballast. I watched the time lapse again, slower this time, as if the hill would tell me a secret if I were patient. The crack gauge showed the faintest of shifts, 1 hairline tick wider over the last 4 hours. My nylon line sagged imperceptibly. I tightened it again and wrote the new length in the logbook. The kind of data nobody cares about until they're ankle deep in the consequences. At 11:06 p.m., my inbox pinged with a city auto reply. Your message has been received. The phrase had become a chorus. I printed my final warning anyway in thick black letters so no one could claim they hadn't seen it. I am imminent landslide, risk halt all work. AAR own Ward Ret, Military Engineering Corps. I slid it into a plastic sleeve, grabbed duct tape, and pulled on my rain shell. Ranger watched me like he wanted to argue. Stay, I said. He didn't. We reached the clubhouse under a steady sheet of rain and taped the notice right beside the HOA's celebration poster. My ugly truth fused to their pretty picture. Coffee donuts, imminent collapse. Choose your adventure. On the walk back, Ranger froze and emitted a sound. I've only heard twice, a low, sustained growl that comes from someplace older than training. I followed his gaze to the dark seam of the tree line above the plaza. It wasn't moving, not yet, but the silence had shifted key. Just after midnight, Sarah called. I got a partial, she said. We can issue a soft advisory in the morning if the rain continues. Aaron, if you can convince them to cancel the event, do it. I can't convince a mirror it's a reflection, I said. I'll try anyway. I sent Kennedy a final note. No rhetoric, just 2 sentences. The county desk review recommends a halt. Cancel the event. If people get hurt, you own it. His out-of-office response arrived in under a minute. See you Saturday at Sycamore Commons, with a smiley face I will remember until my last day. I didn't sleep. Sometimes you don't, not because of fear, but because you owe alertness to the next hour. I sat at the window with Ranger at my feet and listened to the house, listened to the rain. You can feel a pressure change through glass. At 3:41 a.m., the barometer dropped a notch. The air thickened as if the room were being slowly carried down a hallway. I stepped onto the porch. Somewhere on the slope, a root snapped, sharp, fast, unmistakable. A small sound out of place in the rain, the way a dropped fork is loud in a quiet kitchen. At 4:09 a.m., headlights rolled into the cul-de-sac below, then crept toward the taped site. I watched from the dark binoculars, cold against my face. A black SUV nosed up to the service gate and idled. The driver's door opened. Kennedy Morgan stepped out into the rain in a hooded jacket that cost more than one of my crack gauges. He moved quickly, flashlight low, the way people move when they don't want to be recognized by the gods in charge of luck. He crossed to the utility box that feeds the plaza lights, popped it, and did something with his hands. The string lights along the fence blinked and died. He stood there for a long moment, just breathing. Then he got back in the SUV and disappeared the way the guilty try to slow enough to look calm, fast enough to leave. I took 3 stills off the time-lapse feed and saved them to a new folder labeled Pre-Event Kennedy. No speculation attached, just the images and a timestamp. The truth doesn't need commentary, it just needs daylight. By first light, the rain had eased into a fine mist, the kind that tricks you into believing a storm is considerate. I filled a thermos, checked my med kit, and walked Ranger to the ridge. Down below, a cluster of folding tables waited under pop-up canopies. Volunteers moved like ants between boxes of paper cups and white pastry boxes. Someone tested a microphone. The speakers hissed and then cleared. The new concrete pad shone like a promise it couldn't keep. I stood there a long minute with my hand on Ranger's ruff and said, "The thing you say when you've done everything you can do and now the hill owns the next line." "Not yet," I told it, "but you're close." Saturday dawned gray. The kind of gray that doesn't move, doesn't promise, doesn't forgive. You know that color. It's the sky's way of saying, "I warned you." From my porch, I could already hear voices echoing from the lower slope. The HOA's celebration was underway. Balloons bobbed along the new fence line, defying the drizzle. Someone had dragged out a coffee urn and a folding table covered with paper napkins. A banner stretched across 2 metal poles, read in bright, cheerful blue, "Sycamore Commons, where community grows." I almost laughed. The only thing growing was the pressure underground. Ranger stood by the steps, tail low, uneasy. He'd been restless all night, pacing between the window and the door. Dogs know before people do, always have. At 8:30 a.m., I went down anyway, not for the coffee or the speeches, but because I needed to witness the final act. If I was wrong, I'd look paranoid. If I was right, there wouldn't be time for "I told you so." By the time I reached the lower path, a crowd of maybe 30 had gathered. There was Kennedy in his best navy jacket, shaking hands, smiling like the storm itself had RSVP'd. Beside him, Tara handed out paper cups of coffee, as if caffeine could reinforce soil. Cole Benson, clipboard under one arm, supervised 2 men adjusting a ribbon across the center of the slab. I stood at the edge of the caution tape just outside the crowd. Mud clung to my boots, my jacket, and the bottom of my jeans. Kennedy saw me and smirked like a man who thought the world had a script, and he was still the star. "Morning, Mr. Ward," he called across the chatter. "Glad to see you joining us in celebration this time." "Celebration," I said. "That's one word for it." He ignored the tone. Of course he did. Denial makes people fluent in sarcasm. I scanned the site while they made small talk. The slab looked wrong. You learn to read concrete the way a doctor reads faces. This one was pale, streaked darker in places where moisture seeped from underneath. Along its western edge, the surface had cracked hairline thin, a faint, jagged lightning scar. Ranger tugged at his leash and whined. His paw sank half an inch into what should have been firm ground. I pressed my fingers to the soil. It quivered. That's not poetic exaggeration. The ground literally pulsed, breathing slow and heavy like something alive beneath it. Kennedy tapped the mic attached to a small speaker. The feedback squealed. "Good morning, neighbors. Thank you for coming out to celebrate the future of our community." Future, I thought. You're standing on its grave. He went on. "When we first envisioned Sycamore Commons, we wanted a space that symbolized unity, strength, and trust. Maybe start with listening," I muttered, but the applause swallowed it. Then came the speeches, one from Dana Wells, the secretary, about our shared values, another from Tom Erickson, the treasurer, about budget efficiency. I'd sat through enough boardrooms in war zones to know filler when I heard it. All the while, the wind shifted. The rain returned soft at first, then steadier. When Kennedy raised the ceremonial scissors, the first tremor rolled through the crowd. A faint vibration underfoot, subtle enough that most thought it was a passing truck. But my stomach dropped. I felt that kind of tremor before in Peru, Afghanistan, Washington State, name your hillside. It's the ground exhaling after holding its breath too long. I stepped forward. "Kennedy," I shouted, "shut it down. Now." He looked up annoyed. "Aaron, please." Now the microphone squealed again as he lowered it, half smiling, trying to keep his composure. "Let's not ruin the mood with more of Mr. Ward's doomsday scenarios." The next tremor cut him off. Louder, longer. The The coffee cups on the table rattled, and someone gasped. A crack sharp and wet snapped through the air like a tree breaking. Then came the sound that makes every geologist's blood run cold, a low rolling grind like the world itself shifting gears. "Everybody off the pad," I yelled. "Get to high ground now." The smile died on Kennedy's face. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to command, but the hill answered before he could. The slope above the plaza convulsed. A line of alder trees tilted in eerie unison. The ground bulged, rose, and then collapsed like a lung deflating. Mud surged forward, thick and fast, carrying logs, roots, and broken fence posts. Screams filled the air. Coffee spilled. Chairs overturned. The banner tore free, whipping into the air, as if retreating from the chaos it once advertised. I grabbed Eileen by the arm and pulled her back from the edge. Ranger barked furiously, leash taut. The mud swallowed the far corner of the slab with a wet roar, dragging 2 metal benches with it. Kennedy froze for half a second too long, then bolted. Tara stumbled behind him, her shoes suctioned by the muck. Cole tried to pull at the ribbon like it was going to save him. It didn't. The slide didn't move like water, it moved like thoughtless anger, slow and unstoppable. Trees bent their roots, ripped free like snapped cables. The newly built retaining wall cracked, buckled, and folded like cardboard. "Ranger heel," I yelled, and sprinted along the perimeter trail, trying to guide people up toward the cul-de-sac. Mud spattered my jacket. Behind me, the sound deepened a grotesque harmony of rockwood and gravity. Halfway up the path, I turned back. Kennedy and Tara were knee-deep, clawing their way toward solid ground. Cole slipped, caught himself on the rim of a buried fence, then lost his footing again as the wave of mud surged around him. I jumped the guardrail and waded in water and earth rising past my boots. "Over here," I shouted. "Grab my hand." Kennedy reached first, his once perfect jacket soaked in filth. I hauled him forward just as a chunk of the slab behind him disappeared into the flow. Tara followed, sobbing, trembling. Cole wasn't so lucky. He went down to one knee, swallowed halfway before finding purchase on a jutting pipe. I grabbed the back of his collar, pulled with everything I had, and felt something tear fabric, not flesh. Together we stumbled toward the slope's edge until we hit stable ground. By the time emergency sirens cut through the rain, the worst of it had passed. The hill had spoken and then gone still, as if satisfied. The once smooth concrete plaza was gone, replaced by a mangled scar of mud-splintered wood and twisted steel. One of the flatbed trucks had slid sideways, half buried in sludge. The banner lay tangled in branches, its slogan smeared and unreadable. Kennedy collapsed beside me, gasping, mud streaking his face. He looked at me with eyes wide and unfocused, like he'd finally realized he wasn't the main character in this story. "You," he coughed. "You knew. I warned you," I said simply. He stared past me at the ruin below, at the crater where his legacy project had once stood. We could have died. "Some warnings," I said, "are meant to save people who don't want to be saved." A paramedic arrived, taking his vitals, while others rushed to the edge with ropes and stretchers. Eileen helped Tara wrap a blanket around her shoulders. Ranger sat beside me, chest heaving, ears back. As rescue crews combed the debris, one firefighter turned to me and said, "You, the guy who sent the county those warnings." "Yeah," I said. "Good thing you did. Without that footage, we wouldn't have known how unstable this slope was. This could have buried half the lower street. Could have." 2 words that mean everything in a world where seconds decide survival. By evening, the site was cordoned off with yellow tape. Reporters had shown up, cameras flashing through the fog. I stood near the patrol car, giving my statement to a sheriff's deputy. When I finished, he shook his head. "Board's gonna have a hell of a time explaining this one." "Yeah," I said. "Gravity doesn't negotiate." He cracked a tired smile and walked off. As floodlights flickered across the ruined slope, Kennedy limped toward me, his expression hollow. "Aaron," he rasped. We'll make it right." "No," I said. "You'll make it real." He didn't have a comeback. When I got home, I peeled off my mud-caked jacket, set Ranger's bowl by the fire, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the logbook. Every measurement, every warning, every ignored email was there, the story of a disaster, foretold and refused. I underlined one line in black ink: "The ground always keeps score." And that night, while the rain finally began to ease, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Morning came slow, pale, and heavy. It wasn't the kind of dawn that brings clarity, it was the kind that exposes consequences. Mist hung low over the valley, and from my porch, Sycamore Ridge no longer looked like the neighborhood I'd known for 7 years. The hill behind it had changed shape, its once smooth slope now a jagged wound carved into the earth, steaming faintly under the weak sun. The slide had stopped just short of the lower cul-de-sac. Another 30 feet, and it would have taken out 2 houses entirely. The fact that nobody died wasn't luck. It was timing, the kind that doesn't forgive arrogance but sometimes spares stupidity. Ranger sat by my feet, ears perked toward the still silent hillside. I poured my coffee, black and bitter, and watched the county trucks pull in, hazard lights flashing orange in the fog. Men in reflective vests stepped out with clipboards and drones. The geotechnical crew Sarah promised had finally arrived 24 hours too late. Sarah herself was among them. She spotted me from the end of the driveway and walked over, raincoat, zipped hair, tied back in a no-nonsense bun that screamed, "I told you so." "I tried to get here sooner," she said. "You're here now," I replied. "That's more than I can say for the people who caused this." She sighed, pulling a pen from her pocket. "We've got confirmation. The subsurface layer liquefied. Shear plane ran right under that new slab you warned about. When they loaded it with equipment and filled dirt, it acted like a trigger." "Textbook failure." "Textbook," I echoed. "Shame no one in the HOA can read." She gave me a small, tired smile. "County's already filing an incident report. I'll make sure your name's on the record, the one who sent the warnings." "Good," I said, "because they'll pretend I didn't." Sarah nodded toward the tape line where Kennedy stood, flanked by 2 deputies. He looked smaller now, older somehow, his hair plastered against his forehead. The shiny jacket from yesterday's grand opening hung crooked on one shoulder, torn and mud-streaked. He was talking to the deputies, hands twitching, face pale. "They treating it as negligence?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "But they will. There's enough documentation to bury them in paper, if not mud." She wasn't wrong. By noon, the reporters had arrived, 6 local outlets, all circling the wreckage like crows with microphones. Their vans parked along the cul-de-sac, antennas, extended cameras rolling. I stayed back, arms crossed, watching from my fence line. I didn't need to say anything. The scene spoke louder than words. The slab gone, the trucks half buried, the HOA banner shredded and wrapped around a fallen pine. Then one of the reporters, a sharp, dark-haired woman I recognized from the evening news, approached. "Mr. Ward," she asked, voice polite but urgent, "you're the one who warned the HOA, correct?" I exhaled slowly. "Yes." "Can you tell us what you warned them about?" "The truth," I said. "That this slope wasn't safe. That the rain made it worse. That if they didn't stop building, the ground would stop them." "Did they respond?" she pressed. "They fined me for spreading misinformation," I said, air quoting with 2 fingers. "Apparently physics is fake news." The cameraman glanced up, eyes wide behind the lens. The reporter's brow furrowed. And now that it's happened, I looked at the ruin behind her, the mangled fence posts, the mud-caked trucks, the silent, humiliated board. Now I said, "They'll probably call it an accident. But the ground doesn't make mistakes. People do." She nodded, quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Would you go on record for the 6 o'clock broadcast?" "Sure," I said. "Someone's got to say what they won't." By that afternoon, Sycamore Ridge was trending. The video of Kennedy and Cole sprinting through mud made the rounds online under headlines like "HOA ignores warnings, loses everything in landslide." Some called it karma. Others called it negligence. Both were right. Emails flooded the HOA's inbox so fast they shut down comments on their website. The community Facebook page, once a battleground over mailbox paint colors, turned into a digital courtroom. Screenshots of my emails, Eileen's basement photos, even Sarah's early correspondence with the county were reposted and shared with captions like, "They knew." The board met that evening at the clubhouse, or what was left of it. They'd moved folding tables into the community rec room 2 streets up. I didn't plan to attend. I'd had my fill of their smugness, their bureaucracy, their slow-rehearsed gaslighting. But Eileen showed up at my door holding 2 cups of coffee and said, "You need to be there, Aaron, not to argue, to witness." So I went. The room was packed, 30, homeowners crammed into rows of plastic chairs. Kennedy sat at the front leg, wrapped in a brace face, blotchy from stress. Tara sat beside him, trembling hands folded in her lap. Cole wasn't there. Rumor said he'd resigned that morning. Kennedy tapped the microphone. No ceremony this time, just exhaustion. "We're here to address the recent event," he began, voice thin, "and to assure residents that the HOA is cooperating fully with the county investigation." "Cooperating," someone called out from the back. "You built a park on a landslide, Kennedy," another voice followed. "You ignored the warnings." Kennedy raised a hand, but the noise grew. Chairs scraped, voices overlapped, anger layered on disbelief. When he finally managed to shout quiet, the silence that followed was heavier than any storm. He looked around, jaw tight. "Yes, mistakes were made." "Mistakes," I said, standing slowly. "You call that a mistake? A mistake is forgetting to mow your lawn." You gambled with people's homes. He glared at me, but there was no fire left in it. Mr. Ward, please. No, I cut in. I'm done being polite. I sent you data photos analysis. I told you the slope was active. You dismissed it because it didn't fit your agenda. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kennedy's lips trembled, searching for words. We relied on professional assessments. Landscapers, I shot back. You hired landscapers, not engineers. Tara finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. We thought it would be safe. Thinking doesn't stop gravity, I said. Eileen rose beside me. My basement's ruined because of your pride, she said sharply. If that slide had gone 30 feet further, we'd be digging bodies, not mud. Someone in the back clapped. Another followed. Soon the room filled with applause, slow, deliberate, furious applause. Kennedy looked like he might cry. He glanced down at the papers on the table, then at the crowd. The board has decided to step down temporarily while the investigation concludes. Temporarily, always hedging. But I didn't say anything more. The fight was over. The truth had already done the talking. That night, the county declared the site an official hazard zone. Yellow tape expanded around it. No entry, no work. The cost to stabilize the hill was estimated at nearly $400,000, and the HOA's insurance didn't cover acts of negligence. In the following days, letters arrived in every mailbox. Emergency special assessment pending investigation. Homeowners panicked. Some cursed me for being right. Others thanked me for saving them. I didn't care which. The only opinion that mattered was the hills, and it had already rendered judgment. I kept to myself, mostly documenting, writing, cataloging, old habits. Ranger healed from a cut on his paw. I patched the fence he'd torn through during the chaos. Life as it does started rearranging itself into new shapes. On the third day after the collapse, Sarah stopped by, again file folder in hand. The state's opening a formal inquiry, she said. FEMA too. And the Attorney General's office wants to review all your correspondence. You're officially listed as a cooperating witness. Witness, I repeated. That's one word for it. She smiled faintly. Heroes sound too glamorous. I'm not a hero, I said. Just a guy who listens when the ground talks. Sarah looked toward the scarred slope, where excavators were now parked quietly like beasts put in time out. The earth has a cruel way of making itself heard, she said. Not cruel, I corrected. Just honest. She nodded once, then added, You know that footage you captured, the one with Kennedy at the site before the slide? It's raising questions. I raised a brow. Questions like, what? Why he was there at 4 a.m. What he was doing with the power box. Whether he tried to cover something up. I looked down at Ranger, who tilted his head as if sensing the next storm brewing. You mean I said the hill might not be done speaking yet? Sarah gave a grim smile. That's one way to put it. That night, as I sat on the porch, coffee cooling beside me, I watched the mist curl across the broken hillside. In the silence, I could still hear it, the slow, patient heartbeat of the earth, steady beneath all the noise we make, pretending we're in charge. People forget that the ground remembers. It doesn't rage. It doesn't plot revenge. It just waits, until the weight becomes too much to bear. 3 days after the slide, Sycamore Ridge didn't smell like a neighborhood anymore. It smelled like wet clay diesel and insurance paperwork. County crews had set up portable floodlights that burned through the dawn mist, illuminating the wreckage like a stage nobody wanted to stand on. Excavators groaned in slow arcs, scooping the collapsed hillside bucket by bucket into dump trucks that would take it who knows where. But even buried in the mess, the truth has a habit of floating to the surface. Sarah called me early that morning. You might want to come down, she said. We're pulling material from the lower slope. Something's interesting. I arrived within 20 minutes. The rain had stopped, leaving a damp hush over everything. The plaza site was unrecognizable, an open wound of brown-gray and shattered concrete veins. County inspectors milled about in orange vests, setting up drones while firefighters lingered nearby in case of another small slip. Sarah waved me over to the edge where one of the excavator operators had parked his machine. He found this wedged near the base of the power conduit, she said, holding up a bent metal box, a utility control panel half-caked in mud. The lock had been cut clean through. She handed it to a technician who pointed to the wiring. This wasn't torn open by the slide, he said. This was opened manually before it happened. Look here, clean tool marks. Sarah's eyes met mine. You said you saw Kennedy at the site that morning. 4:09 a.m., I replied. He was at that exact spot. I've got the footage. She exhaled slowly. Then he wasn't just checking the lights, he was tampering with the system. Trying to cover his tracks, I said, or shut down the cameras before it happened. The technician nodded grimly. There's a chance the control panel also fed power to the slope sensors they installed last year, the ones monitoring drainage flow. If those were disabled, I didn't need him to finish. If those sensors had been active, they would have recorded ground movement in real time, the final, undeniable proof of what I'd been saying all along. Sarah turned to me. Send me that video clip, Aaron. We'll escalate this. It's officially a criminal inquiry now. The following days unfolded like a slow avalanche of bureaucracy. News crews camped at the neighborhood entrance. The HOA office was dark, its door sealed with a county notice, property under investigation. Kennedy Morgan had gone to ground, not literally this time but close. He'd checked into a motel off Route 12 and hadn't been seen since the day of the collapse. Tara, meanwhile, was fielding what the press called mounting civil exposure. Cole Benson had lawyered up. I didn't gloat. There's no satisfaction in being right when the landscape has already done the screaming for you. Still, the city subpoenaed my footage. I handed over the drive every time-stamped frame from the first crack to the final collapse. The hearing date was set for the following Thursday, and Sarah asked if I'd be willing to testify. Under oath, I asked. She smirked. Is there any other kind? The hearing took place in the downtown Civic Building, high ceilings, echoing walls, the kind of place designed to make truth feel official. I wore a gray blazer that hadn't seen daylight since my retirement ceremony. The air inside smelled like coffee, printer toner, and nervous sweat. When they called my name, I stepped up to the long table, raised my right hand, and took the oath. The lead investigator, a woman named Clarissa Denton, had a calm voice and eyes sharp enough to cut through pretense. Mr. Ward, she began, walk us through your first documented observation of soil instability. I did every date, every measurement, every ignored warning. She listened, never interrupting, only jotting notes. When I mentioned the fines for misinformation, a low murmur rippled through the room. Clarissa waited until I finished. Then she nodded to a technician near the projector. Let's show the footage. The lights dimmed. My time-lapse filled the wall, a silent movie of inevitability. The alder tree leaning the cracks, widening the rain, carving deeper scars into the slope. Gasps echoed through the chamber as the first frame of the collapse rolled. Then finally, the image I'd captured at 4:09 a.m. appeared, Kennedy flashlight in hand, crouching beside the power box. Clarissa froze the frame. Mr. Ward, she said, can you confirm the identity of this individual? Yes, that's HOA President Kennedy Morgan. Was anyone authorized to access this site at that time? No, I said. The area was under a safety advisory pending review. Clarissa folded her hands. In your professional opinion, could this act have contributed to the slide's severity or timing? I looked straight ahead. Disabling the power likely cut off slope monitoring. That means no automated alert system, no real-time data. It didn't cause the hill to move, it just blinded everyone when it did. Silence. Then the low hum of whispers. Clarissa nodded. Thank you, Mr. Ward. That will be entered into the record. I stepped back to my seat as Sarah took the stand next, presenting the county's findings: failure due to oversaturation, improper grading, unauthorized fill material, and lack of compaction standards. Words like gross negligence and reckless oversight peppered her testimony. When Kennedy's attorney spoke, he tried the usual dance: unforeseeable weather conditions, community good faith, unprecedented event. But every defense sounded hollow against the data projected on the wall. At one point, Kennedy himself spoke, voice trembling. We never meant for this to happen. We trusted the information given to us. Clarissa raised an eyebrow. Even after multiple written warnings from a licensed engineer, he hesitated. We believed he was exaggerating. I almost laughed, not out of humor but disbelief at how small arrogance looks when it's cornered. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was clear. The HOA board was being referred to the state attorney's office for formal charges: reckless endangerment, tampering with public safety systems, destruction of county-monitored infrastructure, and willful suppression of safety warnings. The headlines came fast. HOA president under fire after ignoring engineers' warnings. Sycamore Ridge disaster sparks statewide HOA reform bill. The neighborhood that once prided itself on uniform mailboxes was now famous for mud. Eileen stopped by my house that evening holding a casserole dish and a newspaper. They're calling you the man who saw it coming, she said with a smile. Better than what they used to call me, I said, accepting the dish. Hero suits you better than paranoid retiree, she teased. I'll settle for guy who listened. We stood quietly for a moment, looking toward the hill. The sun was setting behind it now, lighting up the raw soil in shades of orange and red like the land was healing but not forgetting. Eileen exhaled. They're saying it'll take 6 months just to stabilize the slope, maybe a year before it's safe to rebuild. Good, I said. Maybe it'll give everyone time to remember how close they came. She nodded. You ever think about joining the new board? They're holding open elections after the investigation. I chuckled. Me, I've had my fill of committees. I work better from the outside, fewer meetings, more truth. Later that night, the neighborhood lights flickered back on. Power had been restored, though not everyone stayed. Half the residents had already listed their homes online, terrified their property values were as unstable as the soil. The rest stayed out of stubbornness or pride, hard to tell which. I sat on the porch with Ranger and listened to the distant hum of the generators. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an owl called low, deliberate, ancient. The ground was quiet again. For now, I knew better than to think silence meant safety. Sometimes silence is just the earth taking its next deep breath, and I'd be there to listen when it exhaled again. 2 days later, Sarah texted me one last photo, the recovered control panel cleaned and cataloged with the serial number visible. Attached was her message, confirmed slope sensors disabled prior to collapse. Investigation expanding to include evidence tampering. I stared at the photo a long time before replying. The ground remembers everything. Now the law will too. That night I finally slept. Deeply, dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that comes when the noise has finally caught up to the people who tried to bury it. But even in my dreams I could still hear it, the faint echo of mud moving trees, cracking the earth, whispering its last warning. You were right, Aaron. But they had to learn the hard way. Spring came late to Sycamore Ridge. Maybe the earth needed time to forgive. For weeks after the last hearing, the hill sat quiet under tarps and scaffolding a scar slowly turning green at the edges. County crews seeded it with fast-growing ryegrass, staked new drainage lines, and drove steel anchors deep into the slope. 20-foot rods meant to hold back what arrogance had unleashed. To the untrained eye, it looked peaceful again. But to me, it was the same wounded animal breathing through stitches. You can make the surface pretty, you can't make it forget. Ranger and I resumed our morning walks, though the air smelled different now. Damp soil, concrete dust, and a trace of something metallic. The kind of smell that lingers after a long fight. Neighbors nodded at me as I passed. Some smiled, some looked away. Everyone knew who I was now, the man who warned them. Half the houses along the lower cul-de-sac stood empty foreclosure notices in the windows. The rest bore signs that felt both desperate and defiant, Stronger Together rebuting hope, thank you first responders. Hope is cheap paint, it chips easy. I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. But tired has its own kind of clarity. One morning as the fog rolled in low over the rooftops, a car pulled up to my gate. It was a dark sedan with government plates. Sarah stepped out, clipboard in hand, wearing that same worn look of someone who's been fighting paperwork wars on too little sleep. You still keeping that logbook? She asked. Every day, I said, patting the weatherproof pouch clipped to my belt. Old habits. She smiled faintly. Good, because you might want to log this too. She handed me an envelope. Official seal. State of Washington, Department of Environmental Quality. I opened it carefully. It was the final report. Conclusion. The Sycamore Ridge landslide was not an act of nature. It was a preventable event caused by unapproved grading, unauthorized fill material, and deliberate disabling of monitoring systems. Responsible parties: Sycamore Ridge HOA, Board of Directors, including President Kennedy Morgan, Vice President Cole Benson, and Secretary Tara Morgan. Result: permanent loss of common area development rights, mandatory restitution, and state supervision of HOA functions for a period of 5 years. I read it twice, then a third time. So that's it, I said. They're finished, mostly, Sarah said. Kennedy's plea deal was accepted this morning. Reckless endangerment and evidence tampering. He won't see prison, too many lawyers, not enough spine, but he'll never hold a public position again. And Tara resigned. Moved out of state. I let out a long breath, half relief, half disappointment. The Hill did what the courts couldn't. Sometimes that's how it goes, Sarah said softly. She reached into her folder again and pulled out a photo, the control panel, the same one found at the base of the slide. Thought you'd want a copy, she said. Proof that you weren't crazy. I never needed proof, I said. Just witnesses. She nodded, slid the photo into my hand, and smiled. You know, they're setting up a new community committee. Safety, oversight, open elections. Eileen Parker's leading it. She asked if you'd help. I laughed quietly. I've had enough of meetings to last a lifetime. Sarah chuckled. I figured you'd say that. But she's calling the project the listening field. Thought that might interest you. That stopped me. The listening field, she nodded. They're planting native wildflowers on the stabilized slope. No concrete, no benches. Just a reminder of what happens when people stop listening to the land. For a long moment, I didn't say anything. I just looked toward the ridge, the soft shape of the hill now faintly touched with green. The sun breaking through mist, like forgiveness, learning how to walk again. Tell her I'll help, I said finally. Not with speeches. With the soil. Weeks passed. The media moved on to new scandals. Sycamore Ridge settled into a rhythm of humility, the kind of quiet you get after something enormous teaches everyone to whisper. I spent my mornings volunteering with Eileen and a handful of neighbors planting wildflowers along the slope. We dug shallow rows, laid seed mats, and raked mulch until our hands blistered. Ranger watched from the shade, occasionally chasing a butterfly or two, the kind of guardian who finally got a break. Eileen worked beside me one afternoon, wiping sweat from her forehead. Never thought I'd see you gardening instead of measuring angles, she teased. Every scar deserves a little color, I said, pressing a handful of soil around a young lupine. She smiled. You know people talk about you like you're some kind of legend, the man who saved the ridge. I shook my head. The ridge saved itself. I just spoke its language. She paused, glancing up at the slope. You ever think about leaving? Used to, I said. But then I realized this place isn't broken. It's honest now. It finally stopped pretending. That evening, I walked the ridge trail one last time before sunset. The new erosion barriers gleamed under the low light. The air was still heavy with the scent of pine sap and fresh dirt. For the first time in months, the ground felt calm. At the overlook, I found a new wooden sign staked into the earth. The listening field dedicated to those who heard too late. Below that, in smaller letters, because the earth always speaks and wisdom begins when we listen. I ran my fingers along the carved letters. They were rough but sure, like something meant to last. Behind me, the wind shifted, carrying faint sounds from the valley. Children's laughter, a hammer striking wood life, creeping back in small but stubborn ways. I sat on a flat stone watching the last of the sun slip behind the trees. You'd think victory feels loud, but it doesn't. It feels like stillness. I took out my logbook, the same one that started this whole story, and wrote the final entry. Date April, third weather, clear skies, light breeze. Observation, ground stable, hill breathing easy. Note, they finally listened. I closed the book and smiled to myself. Somewhere down the road, someone else would build something foolish. Someone else would think they could outsmart nature. That's how the world works. Arrogance regenerates faster than grass. But maybe, just maybe, a few people from this place would remember that listening isn't weakness. It's the only thing stronger than ignorance. Ranger nudged my knee-tail, wagging softly. I scratched behind his ears. We did all right, didn't we, old boy? He gave a soft huff approval, probably, and sat beside me as the light dimmed. The next morning I got one last visit. A delivery driver in a county vehicle dropped off a small plaque and a letter. The plaque read, in recognition of Aaron Ward, for vigilance, integrity, and service to community safety. Presented by the State Department of Emergency Management. The letter was from Sarah. Some heroes wear uniforms, some just pay attention. Thanks for reminding us that the ground doesn't whisper for nothing. I chuckled quietly, then carried the plaque up the ridge and set it against the wooden sign at the listening field. No speeches, no crowd, just me and Ranger and the hum of the earth beneath us. I stood there a while, feeling the faint vibration under my boots, the same heartbeat I'd felt the day it all began, only steadier now. Then I whispered back, message received. Sometimes the world warns us softly, a crack in the concrete, a shifting fence post, a gut feeling that something isn't right. Most people ignore it until the noise gets too loud to pretend it's not there. But the truth, the earth never shouts first. It starts with a whisper. So maybe the lesson isn't about mud or HOA politics. Maybe it's about listening, really listening before the warning becomes a disaster. Because arrogance might build walls, but wisdom plants roots. If you've made it this far, tell me where you're watching from, city, state, or country. And let me know, have you ever ignored a small warning that turned into something big? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe in stories that make us think, laugh, and maybe listen a little harder next time. The ground's always talking. You just have to care enough to hear it.